You're watching Northern Crimes.
July 12th, 1924, Mount St. Helens, Washington. You're a park ranger, and the report that came in this morning sounds like something out of a dime novel. 5 gold prospectors stumbled into Kelso yesterday, claiming they'd been attacked by giant, hairy creatures in the mountains. Most of your colleagues are already writing it off as tall tales from men who'd been alone in the wilderness too long. But here you are, hiking up to their mining claim anyway. The trail winds through dense forest, and with each step higher, the silence grows heavier. No birdsong, no rustling in the underbrush, just the crunch of your boots on pine needles and the distant sound of water running over rocks. Then you see the cabin. The roof is partially caved in, riddled with holes where massive rocks punch through the wooden planks. Boulders the size of watermelons lie scattered around the structure, some weighing easily 100 pounds or more. The door hangs askew, splintered wood jutting out like broken teeth. You circle the building slowly, your hand resting on your sidearm out of instinct. That's when you find them, footprints in the soft earth around the cabin. 16 inches long, clearly defined with 4 stubby toes. Human-like, but impossibly large. They circle the structure in deliberate patterns, as if something had been pacing, hunting. You kneel down and place your own boot next to one of the tracks. Your size 10 looks like a child's shoe in comparison. Because in the Pacific Northwest, where legends are born in the shadow of ancient peaks, sometimes the evidence speaks louder than the skeptics. And sometimes what you find in the wilderness changes everything you thought you knew about what's possible. This is Northern Crimes. On July 11th, 1924, 5 exhausted and terrified gold prospectors stumbled into a tavern in Kelso, Washington, with a story so extraordinary it would become one of the most famous Bigfoot encounters in American history. What they claimed to have experienced in a remote gorge on Mount St. Helens would forever alter the world of cryptozoology and give birth to a legend that endures nearly a century later. The men, Fred Beck, Marion Smith, his son Roy Smith, Gabe Lefevre, and John Peterson, had been working a mining claim near the Lewis River for several weeks. They'd built a crude log cabin as their base camp, situated in a narrow gorge on the southeastern flanks of Mount St. Helens, a location that would later become known as Ape Canyon. From the beginning, the wilderness around them didn't feel quite right. For days, the miners reported disturbing signs that something or someone was watching them. Enormous footprints, some as long as 16 inches with 4 stubby toes, began appearing around their camp. The tracks were too large for a bear and too human-like for any known animal. The prints circled the cabin in wide loops, returning night after night. Then came the sightings. Dark figures moving between the trees, nearly 7 feet tall, walking upright and covered in thick, matted hair. The prospectors estimated the creatures weighed at least 400 pounds each, with barrel chests and long, powerful limbs. At first, the miners tried to dismiss what they saw, blaming fatigue, imagination, or the play of shadows. But the sightings kept happening, and the footprints kept returning. On the afternoon of July 11th, the unease turned to outright terror. While returning to camp, Beck and Marion Smith encountered 4 of the creatures emerging from a ravine directly in their path. For a moment, both groups froze, the air around them thick with tension. Then, without warning, one of the creatures stepped forward and let out a deep, guttural roar that echoed across the canyon walls. Beck's companion stumbled back in fear, but Beck raised his rifle and fired. He claimed his fourth shot struck the creature squarely, knocking it off its feet and sending it tumbling into the ravine. The other creatures howled and vanished into the forest. The miners sprinted back to their cabin, barricading the door and reinforcing the windows with whatever they could find. They grabbed their weapons and waited. As night fell, they could feel the woods around them come alive. Around midnight, the nightmare returned. The cabin was rocked by massive blows from outside. Heavy rocks and boulders began crashing down on the roof, smashing through the crude wooden structure. The men heard the creatures howling as they surrounded the cabin, attacking from every direction. The roof caved under the weight of repeated strikes. A hole opened above them, allowing rocks to fall directly into the cabin. At one point, one of the beings pried open a gap in the door and attempted to break in. Roy Smith met it with an axe, hacking at the figure until it withdrew. Marion Smith fired his pistol through the opening, driving the creature back into the night. Then a rock burst through the roof and struck Fred Beck in the head, knocking him unconscious. He remained senseless for 2 hours while the others continued to defend the cabin. Outside, the roars continued, primal, furious, and unrelenting. Finally, as dawn broke, the attack ceased. The forest fell silent. The prospectors waited, listening for movement before cautiously gathering their gear and fleeing down the mountain. They didn't stop until they reached the town of Kelso. When park rangers J.H. Huffman and Bill Welsh later investigated the scene, they found the cabin exactly as described. The roof damaged, furniture overturned, and the floor littered with stones. Giant footprints encircled the structure. While skeptics would later demonstrate how tracks could be faked using carved wooden feet or even manipulated hands, they couldn't explain the scale or duration of the assault. The incident became national news. Newspapers dubbed it the Battle of Ape Canyon, and the name stuck, permanently linking the remote gorge to the creature sightings. To this day, the Ape Canyon Attack remains one of the most detailed and dramatic Bigfoot encounters ever recorded. Whether an elaborate hoax, a case of mistaken identity, or something more mysterious, the story continues to fascinate believers and skeptics alike, a tale whispered through the forests of Washington for nearly 100 years. On July 4th, 1983, while fireworks lit the sky across America, 27-year-old Teresa Peroni attended a party in the quiet town of Selma, Oregon. She was there looking for connection, a fresh start, and healing. But that night would mark the beginning of one of Oregon's most enduring cold cases, a mystery that spanned 4 decades before finally being solved. Teresa was in the middle of rebuilding her life. Originally from Oregon, she'd left the state in 1974 when she married and moved to Texas. But her marriage crumbled, and while visiting family in California, she was served with divorce papers. It was a devastating blow. Still, she returned home to Oregon, determined to start over. Emotionally wounded, but spiritually hopeful. Her brother, Russell Neal, would later recall how shattered she'd been and how hard she was trying to move forward. A major part of Teresa's transformation was her newfound faith. She joined a local church and, in a symbolic act of renewal, was baptized in a creek, with Russell performing the ceremony. The moment was a powerful turning point for her, a declaration that she was no longer defined by her past. But her history was complicated. Teresa and her brother had grown up in a traumatic household, fleeing at different times from an abusive stepfather. She also struggled with epilepsy, which caused seizures that made it difficult to hold steady work. Her financial situation was tenuous, but she was doing everything she could to create a better life. At the July 4th gathering, Teresa was accompanied by her boyfriend, Mark Sanfratello, a man she'd started dating after returning to Oregon. But their relationship was volatile. Friends and family noticed frequent arguments, some of them about jealousy, others about Teresa's decision to embrace religion. According to case files, Sanfratello had grown increasingly agitated over her faith reportedly becoming, quote, really furious with her after she joined the church. That night, witnesses saw the couple arguing at the party. Around 1:30 a.m. on July 5th, the two walked together into the woods near the party site, and Teresa was never seen alive again. When she didn't return home, her family immediately feared the worst. This wasn't a woman who would vanish without explanation. They reported her missing and pushed for answers, but the investigation dragged on for years with little progress. Generations of law enforcement officers would eventually cycle through the case, each hitting the same dead ends. Then, in 1997, 14 years after Teresa's disappearance, a landowner stumbled upon a human skull in the woods near where she'd last been seen. The remains were sent to the University of North Texas for DNA analysis, but the technology of the time couldn't produce a definitive ID. The skull was cataloged as Jane Doe, and the case went cold once again. It wasn't until 2024 that the Josephine County Sheriff's Office revisited the evidence using advanced forensic tools, including genetic genealogy. Investigators compared the DNA to Teresa's surviving family members, and after 4 decades of silence, finally confirmed what many had long suspected. The skull belonged to Teresa. With her identity established, attention quickly returned to the last person known to have been with her, Mark Sanfratello, now 72 years old and living in Chico, California. On a Saturday morning in 2024, officers arrested him on murder charges. As investigators dug into Sanfratello's background, a disturbing pattern emerged. Just 2 years after Teresa's disappearance, he'd been charged with attempted murder, and burglary, and the brutal stabbing of his ex-wife and her 14-year-old daughter. He served more than 15 years in prison for the attack and was later charged in federal court for the theft of U.S. government property. After all these years, justice had finally caught up. For Teresa's brother Russell, the arrest brought a mixture of grief and closure. She had a lot of hurt and damage done to her, but she still remained a loving person. He believes she's finally found the peace that eluded her in life. 42 years after she vanished in the woods, Teresa Peroni's voice is no longer lost. On the evening of October 13th, 1970, just 4 days before her 18th birthday, Helen Claire Frost told her sister Sandy that she was going for a walk and stepped out into the crisp autumn air in Prince George, British Columbia. She never returned. What began as a quiet stroll quickly became one of Canada's most enduring mysteries, and what many now consider the first case linked to the region's notorious Highway of Tears. Helen was born on October 17, 1952, in Reigate, England, to Dennis and Daphne Frost. Her father was a decorated Green Beret who served with the British Commando Brigade for 12 years and then worked on the London docks during World War II. In 1956, hoping for a better life, the Frost family immigrated to Canada and eventually settled in Nanaimo, British Columbia, where Dennis found work as a sweeper operator. By 1969, Helen had moved to Prince George in search of independence and opportunity. That November, her younger sister Sandy joined her, and the two shared an apartment on the 1600 block of Queensway with a young woman named Darlene and her baby. Helen worked a variety of jobs to support herself, bussing tables at the Hudson's Bay Company cafeteria, picking berries, and even painting gas stations along Highway 16. But in the spring of 1970, Helen's life took a drastic and heartbreaking turn. Unmarried and pregnant, she left for a home for unwed mothers in Kamloops, where she gave birth to a daughter, Sandra Jeanette, on May 13th. The baby's father, Stefan Grumpner, abandoned Helen shortly after the birth. Alone and overwhelmed, she was forced to place her daughter for adoption, a decision that left a deep emotional scar. That summer, Helen tried unsuccessfully to regain custody. Sandy recalled seeing her sister exit the social worker's office in tears, devastated and silent. The subject was never brought up again, but the weight of that moment lingered. Helen's relationship with Stefan had ended, and she seemed increasingly adrift in the months that followed. Still, on the night she disappeared, Helen didn't seem out of sorts. When Sandy returned from coffee with a friend around 8 p.m., Helen asked if she wanted to go for a walk. Sandy declined, citing the cold weather. So Helen set out alone around 8:20 p.m., wearing a navy blue nylon coat with fake fur trim and blue pants. She didn't take her purse or any money. She left behind all her belongings and was never seen again. By October 15th, Sandy knew something was wrong. Helen wasn't the kind of person to disappear without explanation. She contacted the RCMP, but the response was routine and dismissive. At the time, missing teenage girls were often assumed to be runaways, and valuable time was lost in the early stages of the investigation. Few leads emerged. One unconfirmed tip suggested Helen had been seen hitchhiking from a Husky gas station, but that report was never substantiated. Extensive searches of nearby forests, rivers, and roads turned up nothing. What makes Helen's case even more significant is its timeline. She vanished along Highway 16, a stretch that would later become infamous as the Highway of Tears, where dozens of women, many of them indigenous, have disappeared or been murdered over the last 5 decades. In fact, I've done a number of videos about these stories. Helen's disappearance is believed to be the first documented case along that route. Despite this, the RCMP declined to include her case in Project EPANA, the special task force investigating Highway of Tears victims. Officials said her case didn't meet the criteria, a decision that continues to frustrate her family. But in 2018, nearly 50 years after Helen vanished, a remarkable twist brought her story back into the light. Her daughter, now an adult known as Michelle Johnston, had begun searching for her birth mother using DNA testing and genealogy research. That search led her to Sandy and to the heartbreaking truth that her mother had vanished without a trace just months after her birth. Today, more than half a century later, Helen Claire Frost remains missing. Her fate is unknown, her story unfinished. She was the first, but tragically not the last, to disappear along Canada's most infamous highway, a place where silence stretches for miles and justice has yet to arrive. On the night of January 3rd, 1997, in the quiet, affluent suburb of Bellevue, Washington, a senseless act of violence would unravel a family and shock the nation. What began as a late-night meetup between teenagers escalated into one of the most brutal family slayings in Pacific Northwest history. The killers were just 17 years old and claimed they did it simply to feel what it was like. The victims were the Wilson family, 20-year-old Kimberly Ann Wilson, her father Bill, her stepmother Rose, and her younger sister Julia, who was just 17. They were a typical middle-class family living in one of Bellevue's safest neighborhoods, the kind of place where doors were left unlocked and murders were the furthest thing from anyone's mind. But Kimberly had recently developed a casual friendship with 2 local teens, Alex Kevin Burrani and David Carpenter Anderson. Both boys were known in their social circles as brooding outcasts. They belonged to a goth group that met regularly at a local Denny's, a group that dabbled in role-playing games with often dark, violent themes. But Burrani and Anderson took it much further, often speaking casually about killing, as if it were a fantasy they might one day try to fulfill. On January 3rd, Burrani lured Kimberly to Woodbridge Water Tower Park in Bellevue under false pretenses. What happened next was later reconstructed through his confession. There, in the cold and quiet of the park, Burrani strangled Kimberly to death with a cord. There was no heated argument, no emotional trigger. It was calculated, cold, premeditated. But he didn't stop there. Fearing Kimberly might have told her family where she was going, Burrani made a horrifying decision. He would eliminate anyone who could contact him through the crime. Later that night, he walked to the Wilson family home, armed with a baseball bat and a combat knife. He first entered the master bedroom, attacking Rose Wilson in her sleep. As she struggled, her husband Bill came to her defense, only to be beaten and stabbed to death as well. After finishing off Rose with a knife, Burrani climbed the stairs and found Julia. She fought desperately. Her arm was broken in the struggle, but she too was stabbed repeatedly. Before leaving the house, Burrani stole several items: a phone, a CD player, and a VCR. Whether as trophies or afterthoughts, the theft would later prove crucial in linking him to the murders. The next day, concerned relatives arrived at the house after no one had answered phone calls. Cars were still in the driveway, lights were on, but no one came to the door. Detective Jeff Gromes responded to the welfare check and found the sliding glass door slightly ajar. Inside, he walked into one of the most brutal crime scenes the Bellevue Police Department had ever encountered. At first, both Burrani and Anderson claimed they'd all been together that night, playing video games, but their alibi quickly fell apart under scrutiny. Witnesses contradicted their timeline, and investigators found physical evidence, including bloodied shoes, with tread patterns that matched those at the crime scene. Just 5 days after speaking with detectives, Burrani confessed. When asked why he did it, his response was chilling. He said he was, quote,
in a rut,
and wanted to experience something, quote,
truly phenomenal.
Anderson initially denied involvement, but DNA evidence and witness accounts eventually placed him at the scene. Both teens were charged with 4 counts of aggravated first-degree murder and tried as adults. They were each sentenced to 4 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole, but the case didn't end there. In 2012, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled in Miller v. Alabama that mandatory life sentences without parole for juveniles were unconstitutional. As a result, both men were resentenced. In 2022, Anderson received a new sentence, life with the possibility of parole after 33 years. In 2024, Burrani was resentenced to life with the possibility of parole after 46 years. The Bellevue Murders shattered the illusion of safety in one of Washington's wealthiest suburbs. They remain a chilling reminder that evil doesn't always look like a monster. Sometimes it looks like the teenager down the street, bored, detached, and willing to kill just to see what it feels like. In the early hours of August 31st, 1961, in a quiet neighborhood of Tacoma, Washington, 8-year-old Anne-Marie Burr vanished from her home without a trace. She was the oldest of 4 children in a well-respected Catholic family, a bright third grader who loved horseback riding, piano lessons, and taking care of her younger siblings. Her disappearance would become one of the most perplexing and heartbreaking cold cases in Washington history, and decades later, some would suspect that it may have been the first known crime committed by Ted Bundy. The Burr family lived in a modest home on North 14th Street. That night, Anne-Marie had gone to bed as usual, but around midnight she got up to comfort her 3-year-old sister Mary, who was crying from a recent arm injury. Her mother, Beverly Burr, tended to Mary and then helped Anne-Marie back to bed. Everything seemed normal, but by 5:30 a.m., Beverly awoke to a terrible silence. She noticed the front door was wide open. Anne-Marie was gone. The only clues were a slight scuff mark on the living room bench and an open window in the basement. A window too small for any adult to enter comfortably, but possibly large enough for a small person to slip through. Within hours, a massive search was underway. Police combed through the neighborhood, and the National Guard and hundreds of volunteers joined the effort. Authorities even drained a nearby section of the Puyallup River, desperate to find any sign of the missing child. Nothing turned up. The only potential evidence was a set of faint footprints found leading away from the home, believed to belong to a child and possibly an adult, but no fingerprints, blood, or other physical evidence could be linked to a suspect. At the time, police pursued several leads, including a local man with a history of mental illness and a teenager who reportedly had an obsession with young girls, but both were eventually ruled out. Despite intense public interest and national media attention, the case quickly went cold. Years later, a disturbing theory began to emerge. In 1961, a 14-year-old boy named Theodore Robert Bundy was living just a few miles away in Tacoma. He delivered newspapers in the Burr's neighborhood. Bundy would later become one of the most infamous serial killers in American history, convicted of murdering at least 30 women in the 1970s, though he claimed his actual number of victims was much higher. During Bundy's confessions on death row, he never admitted to abducting Anne Marie, but he reportedly told a prison psychologist that his, quote, first murder was committed in the early 1960s when he was a teenager. He even described how he left the victim's body in a construction site that was later covered with concrete. In 1961, a construction site existed just 3 blocks from the Burr home. Anne Marie's parents, Donald and Beverly Burr, believed Ted Bundy may have been involved. In 1987, Beverly wrote him a letter while he was on death row, pleading for answers. Bundy wrote back, denying any involvement, but offering vague and unsolicited theories about how the abduction might have occurred. He even said he could, quote, empathize with the kidnapper, referring to the crime as terrible, but understandable to anyone who once had the impulse to do such a thing. In 2011, Anne Marie's DNA was compared to unidentified remains found in Florida that some believed may have belonged to one of Bundy's earlier victims, but the results were inconclusive. To this day, no one has been charged in connection with her disappearance. Her body has never been found. Her name isn't on the list of confirmed Bundy sightings, but her case remains one of the most compelling mysteries in the long shadow cast by his crimes. On February 23, 1980, 30-year-old Dorothy Dottie Silzel wrapped up her shift at Gaetano's Pizza in Kent, Washington, and headed home to her East Hill condo. It was a typical Saturday night for the Boeing instructor who balanced 2 jobs to support herself. But 3 days later, when she didn't show up for work at Boeing, concerned coworkers called police for a welfare check. What officers found inside her home would launch one of the longest-running cold cases in Washington state history. Dottie was originally from Mandan, North Dakota, where she graduated high school and worked for the local school district before moving west to the Seattle area. She eventually settled in Kent, Washington. Known for her tireless work ethic, she served full-time as a training supervisor at Boeing in Renton and spent weekends waitressing at Gaetano's Pizza. But she wasn't just hardworking, she was generous with her time, volunteering each year for the Special Olympics, and was beloved by her large family. Her recent purchase of a condo symbolized the independence and stability she'd worked so hard to achieve. On February 26th, Kent Patrol Officer Bob Burwell arrived to perform the welfare check. What he discovered would stay with him for the rest of his life. Dottie had been murdered inside her home. She suffered blunt force trauma to the head and had been strangled to death, killed by cervical compression. The scene was disturbing. There were no signs of forced entry, indicating she may have known her attacker or been tricked to letting him in. The medical examiner confirmed that Dottie had also been sexually assaulted, adding to the brutality of the crime. Detectives combed through the condo, collecting and preserving evidence, including DNA samples that would become crucial years later. At the time, though, DNA analysis was limited. The Washington State Patrol Crimes Lab could only confirm the genetic material belonged to an unidentified man labeled Individual A. Despite dedicated efforts from multiple detectives over the years, no match was ever found. Dozens of DNA profiles were tested, all to no avail. The case remained cold until 2015, when Dottie's family reached out to Sergeant Tim Ford, head of Kent's Major Crimes Unit. Instead of assigning the file to another detective, Ford took the case on himself, an act of personal commitment that would change the outlook of this case. Over the next 9 years, he relentlessly pursued leads, driven by a promise to Dottie's family. In 2022, a breakthrough came. Senior forensic genealogist Misty Gillis used new technology to identify 11 possible relatives linked to Individual A's DNA. 2 of those relatives were brothers Kurt and Kenneth Kundert, living in Arkansas. Kurt willingly provided a DNA sample and was quickly ruled out. Kenneth, however, refused, raising immediate red flags. Investigators learned that in 1980, Kenneth had lived with Kurt in an apartment complex just 1,200 feet away from Dottie's condo. He'd also worked in Snohomish County in the late 1980s, placing him firmly in Washington during the time frame of the murder. In March 2024, Sergeant Ford and his team traveled to Clinton, Arkansas to conduct surveillance on Kenneth. They recovered a discarded cigarette butt, and the DNA on it was a match for individual A. On August 20th, 2024, authorities arrested 65-year-old Kenneth Kundert for the murder of Dorothy Silzel. After evading justice for 44 years, he was taken into custody, held on $3 million bail, and is now awaiting extradition to Washington. For Dottie's family, the arrest was both relieving and bittersweet. Her parents had passed away without seeing justice, but her siblings finally had the answers they'd waited decades for. As her brother Kenny put it, "We were so blessed to have her in our life." Sergeant Ford, who retired shortly after the arrest, had fulfilled the promise he made, and after 44 years, Dottie Silzel's story could finally have an ending, one where her killer is no longer free. On August 14th, 1986, 14-year-old Jeremy Bright vanished without a trace from the Coos County Fair in Myrtle Point, Oregon, a bustling summer celebration that turned into the backdrop of one of the most haunting missing person cases in the state's history. Jeremy had traveled from Grants Pass to visit his stepfather and attend the fair with his 10-year-old sister. It was supposed to be a carefree day in a familiar town where he'd grown up before moving away. The siblings planned to split up and meet at the Ferris wheel at 5 p.m., Jeremy never showed up. That afternoon, around 4:45 p.m., Jeremy made a long-distance call to his mother, Diane, who was back in Grants Pass. She later recalled that nothing in his voice hinted at distress or danger. It was the last confirmed contact anyone had with him. His sister waited at the Ferris wheel, growing increasingly anxious. Jeremy had always been protective, responsible, and close with his sister. He wouldn't have broken their plans without a word. As the sun set and the fair lights flickered on, the nightmare began to take shape. Jeremy stood out, 6 feet tall, 140 pounds, with brown hair, green eyes, and a broken index finger wrapped in a splint. He had scars on his forehead and nose, a mole on his chin. That day, he wore a black windbreaker, red tank top, blue nylon shorts, and black Nike sneakers with red laces. Initially, police treated the case as a teenage runaway situation. They suggested he'd gone off with friends or skipped town on a whim. But Jeremy had no history of that kind of behavior, and his personal belongings, including his wallet and watch, were left behind. A crucial 24 hours passed before the case was treated as a serious disappearance, and then came the rumors. Some claimed Jeremy had been at a party and unknowingly consumed a beer laced with drugs, overdosing in front of other teams who panicked and hid his body. Others whispered about a tragic accident during a swim in the Coquille River, where Jeremy had allegedly been shot during reckless target practice and later buried in the woods by those involved. Amid the speculation, one name kept surfacing: Terry Lee Steinhoff, Jeremy's former babysitter. Several witnesses reported seeing Jeremy in Steinhoff's truck on the day he vanished. When questioned by police, Steinhoff gave evasive answers and refused to cooperate further. 2 years later, in 1988, Steinhoff was arrested for the brutal stabbing of 32-year-old Patricia Morris. He was convicted of murder and sentenced to life in prison. Authorities tried multiple times to get him to talk about Jeremy. He never did. In 2007, Steinhoff died in prison from a drug overdose, taking whatever he knew with him. Despite numerous tips and search efforts over the years, including a 2016 dive into a remote pond 25 miles from Myrtle Point, Jeremy's body has never been found. In 2011, on the 25th anniversary of his disappearance, Jeremy's family held a memorial service. They publicly acknowledged the likelihood that he was dead, but pleaded for answers. "We just want to bring him home." The case was featured on Unsolved Mysteries in 1989, giving it national exposure, but no major leads ever emerged. Police now believe Jeremy was abducted and murdered, and that his remains are hidden somewhere in the rugged terrain of Coos County, an unforgiving wilderness that can swallow secrets for decades. Today, Jeremy Bright would be 52 years old. His story remains a heartbreaking reminder of how quickly a child can vanish, and how, even after nearly 40 years, justice can still feel just out of reach. The Pacific Northwest keeps its secrets well. A boy disappears into a crowd, a scream echoes through the trees, a name fades from headlines but not from memory. Time moves on, but the weight of the unknown remains, not loud, just there, like someone watching from the tree line. And in towns wrapped in fog and forest, people still wonder what really happened, because some stories don't end, they just wait.